Are there questions? Yes, there are. You, sir, over on the side of there. Let's get a mic to you so that people can hear what you have to say. Come on. Go ahead. Identify yourself.
Jeff Weisenfeld, and any of the Center for Security Policy. Any of those of you who are most familiar with the capital markets in your presentation, as you may know, China shares on the exchange are now available for sale to investors here. What is the likelihood that there are a goodly number of those companies which have Potemkin villages and many of the other characteristics that have been described this morning that could ultimately cause investors here a real problem?
Question for anybody. Roger?
We have not, frankly, in our shop, been looking at the entire spectrum of fraud and misdeeds of the type that's been described today. What we are focusing on, and I think I can speak to, are two what I would call material asymmetric risk categories. National security abuses and human rights related abuses. That is our specialty. And in that regard, I was trying to give some illustrations of the fact that there is precious little, if any, due diligence being performed on what are decidedly material risk categories here. Now, that's evident when you look at the presence of companies with the kinds of profiles that I was talking about, including the Hikvisions vis-a-vis concentration camps in Xinjiang. You know, this is not what the American people had in mind. And I would only turn it over to others to talk to the issue, to other glaring problems. And hopefully those are being detected as well. But I can tell you where there is a glaring blind spot here, and that's in these two categories.
So I'm glad you asked the question. It's one thing that I think all of us forgot to mention, and it hits on something that both Roger and Dan talked about. You know, today, the Chinese companies that list, if an ADR lists in the US, there's a level 1, level 2, level 3 ADR. Those all have different listing requirements. So today, someone like a Chinese bank can actually raise money in the US market by selling shares, and all they have to send us is a 15-page picture-filled glossy annual report. No financials, no audit. No one has to understand what is happening behind the scenes. Our listing requirements are crazy. Our SEC could snap a finger and simply say, everyone that raises money in the US, whether it's a stock or a bond, might have to have a real audit and might have to have financials filed just like American companies do. I mean, leveling the playing field is a snap of a finger, and the SEC should do it tomorrow. So to your point, if someone can list on the over-the-counter exchange or under a level 3 or level 2 ADR, it's insane that US investors can get taken by these frauds when we should simply force audits and financial statements to get filed. So that's another something that can happen very quickly.
Yeah, I'll keep it as a short answer. Is there risk? I have piles of reports on frauds that I haven't gotten to yet. I'll be exposing some of them this year. But in an asymmetrical, a binary kind of system where you don't go to jail for fraud, but you can make money for committing it, they're going to continue to commit fraud. There are several multi-billion-dollar major IPO ADR frauds listed on our exchange, and they will be coming to a short sellers report near you soon.
John, did you have a question? John Katsimatidis?
John Katsimatidis. We have a lot of smart people on Wall Street. What is it going to take to get the message across to these guys that it's America first? It's us. versus the dollars they're making today for this quarter. And I know Wall Street and the companies are, what are we going to make this quarter versus what are we going to make over the next 2 or 3 years?
I used to run fixed income research at Bank of America, credit strategies at Credit Suisse. The problem is that the U.S.-China economic relationship is to a great extent the construct of American companies. America's best performing companies in terms of market cap, big tech, are largely software companies with monopolies made possible by cheap Asian electronics. So it's in the interest of the Facebooks and the Googles and so forth to keep the current arrangement where Asia dumps, particularly China, very large amounts of cheap smartphones and computers and tablets on us, while they make the money on the software. Because hardware production is subsidized in Asia, Americans have gotten out of the business. As a matter of fact, there's essentially zero venture capital going into any kind of hardware production, much less investment in the United States. So we're losing our semiconductor industry. What will it take? I think what would be required, it'd be good to get Steve back in the White House. I think the president would have to get the chairman of the top 10 tech companies into the Oval Office and say, you boys have $1 trillion of cash in the bank, you're not investing. You tell me what it will take to put that stuff into brick and mortar and silicon and so forth before I find a way to tax it away from you. That's what I think it will take. Take the president to get down and dirty with them.
He's the only one that has the courage.
You're not going to like this answer, but what it's going to take is not only the political leadership, but it's probably going to take a terrible incident. We Americans are completely oblivious until some of us die. That's the lesson of 9/11, and this is what's going to happen. And the Chinese are forcing this because we see increasingly, you served on the destroyer in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea and the East China Sea, there's dangerous Chinese intercepts of our planes and our vessels in the global commons. And some of those have gotten to the point where almost Americans have died. That's what it's going to take.
It's worse than that, though. Let's talk about that. Not about Wall Street getting understand. They fully understand. Corporate America is the lobbying arm for the Chinese Communist Party, and Wall Street is the investor relations department. Okay? Come on. This is the open secret. Bob Davis of the Wall Street Journal had an article 3 or 4 weeks ago about the pressure on President Trump coming from the hedge fund community on Wall Street, telling him, hey, if you don't sign a deal, if we don't sign up the deal to buy $2 trillion, the Chinese buy $2 trillion of soybeans, but leave aside any structural changes to the Chinese economy, particularly forced technology transfers and the subsidies of state-owned industries. Because remember, China's greatest export, the CCP's greatest export, is deflation and overcapacity. The reason Japanese industrial production can't get up, Western Europe, the United States, there's so much overcapacity financed by the West that the Chinese have. These people are unregistered foreign agents. And I would respectfully submit if Paul Manafort and Mike Flynn and others on the Russia hoax investigation of President Trump about a nation that is smaller than the economy of New York State and a demographic death spiral that has no technology, they should look at who are the foreign agent representatives unregistered on Wall Street in corporate America that every day bombard the Oval Office with, you have to sign a deal. And don't worry about the structural stuff. We've taken off the table, and I apologize personally to the people in China watching this. We took off the table any mention of the firewall. It can't even be mentioned. It's not even in the trade negotiations. The firewall that enslaves the Chinese people digitally and by information is not even on the table. So I think the way you do it is the American people once again vote a populist economic nationalist like Trump, hold people like Biden accountable, and eventually get the law enforcement apparatus of the Justice Department to look into this.
I mean, the question is, when will American banks Get it? And I think we have to all come to realize there are no American banks. They're domiciled here, and our laws protect them. They should be here, but they are beholden to their shareholders. And that's who they report to, profit-driven, as they should be. That's capitalism. But the fact that they're American is incidental, and probably because they need the protection of the United States. But they're beholden to their shareholders, and if that's coming out of China, which it is, they're going to be a political arm for China, and have been.
I would only add that there is a huge disconnect here between fund managers and average Americans who have portfolios. Nobody knows what's in their pension systems. I mean, I certainly don't. In other words, it's a long list of companies. It's sort of faceless fund managers that are running those portfolios. And we, the people, have no idea of the nature of the Chinese companies, now that we're on this subject, that are in our respective portfolios. This can be index funds, mutual funds, our public pension systems, and the list goes on. So it's a matter of freedom of speech. It's a matter of information. If we really knew, for example, if the California teachers' pension system actually knew that they were holding Hikvision, which has the surveillance cameras that are incarcerating 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang behind barbed wire and walls, I don't think they'd be amused. So if you take that argument, and not to mention on the military and national security side, and the point that Gordon was making, when we have an incident, will that weapon system have been built by AVIC or China Shipbuilding? Gee, I wonder where they are. They're in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. Are they going to be next in the Bloomberg Barclays aggregate bond fund? In other words, it's also moving strongly into Chinese mainland companies. Who are these folks? These are the questions we need to be asking, because this is our money. And just to close on one last point that I didn't make, which is the pace of Chinese funds in our market. These indexes of funds are the greatest discovery Beijing could have ever made. I mean, they are one-stop shopping because they send companies viral instantly into every cell of the American body politic. And if you have this pace continue of trillions of dollars of funds moving into American investment portfolios, you could wake up 2 or 3 years from now and realize that 17% or 22% of your retirement system is in Chinese securities. And if that's the case, then you would have taken today's China lobby and made that seem like tinker toys, because you'd have a lobby of well over 100 million Americans. I don't know how many Americans are in the market, but I suspect it gets up more like 200. The point is that if you want to see a lobby, if you want to see the definition of checkmate, it's when they realize that sanctions or penalties of any kind toward China because of its malevolent behavior around the world is going to result in a devaluation of their investment and retirement funds. You're going to see a lobby that doesn't quit, and that's the day that we've allowed this to get completely out of control.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Betsy McCoy. In the headlines this week, there are many statements by Larry Kudlow and others in the administration predicting that a finalized trade agreement is likely soon. You've made it clear that at least most of you are opposed to that agreement, but can you give us some more specifics on what Steve Mnuchin and others who are going to China soon should actually ask for? Give us some changes.
Well, for my part, a bilateral investment treaty that says thou shalt not steal and not go to jail. I mean, I think that would be fair, right? Because if we steal from them, which we have done through the EB-5 program, a pathway to citizenship, There have been times where American fraudsters have stolen from Chinese citizens, and our government has gotten that money back and made those Chinese citizens whole. Because that's what we should do. But they should do the same. And that's a bilateral investment treaty that could make that happen, and we could get our money back.
Yeah, Betsy, I think we have heard that the discussions in Beijing in about a week or so are going to be about enforcement mechanism. And essentially, we have heard that this enforcement mechanism is going to be an established dialogue procedure. In other words, an office in Washington and another office in Beijing where American and Chinese officials will talk to each other. Well, that's just a recipe for stalling. And as Chinese stall, we've seen this in the past. They just steal more U.S. technology and they engage in further trade predation. And especially the credit card situation where China promised access to American credit card companies by 2006. Today, no U.S. credit card company has issued its own card in China. That's the question of stalling. There is some talk about how China will promise not to retaliate if we issue some sort of cost for China violating a trade deal. So China violates the trade deal, we impose some costs, China agrees not to retaliate. That's just fantasy land. I mean, I don't understand how that's enforceable. The only thing that's going to be enforceable is a tariff which is not 25%, but 250%. We have to impose the costs that are higher than the benefits China gets from stealing U.S. technology. And whatever that number is, that's what we need to do in terms of tariffs and other costs.
President Trump reiterated this in the State of the Union when he said, I will bring structural changes to the relationship we have with the Chinese economy, not just some deal that buys $2 trillion worth of soybeans. Those 6 verticals, that is the fundamental restructuring of the Chinese economy. This is not a trade deal. It's not a trade negotiation. This is an armistice on an economic war that the Chinese Communist Party, the radical cadre, has run against the industrial democracies for 20 years. This is an armistice. In that armistice, the 2 central points, Gordon's exactly correct. If we do what's been written in the paper, that's nothing more than the Clinton, Bush, Obama strategic economic dialogue. That's just going to tap us along as they continue to do it. You have to have monitoring. The key is monitoring. Real-time monitoring and then execution and punitive tariffs. Tariffs that stay on and then tariffs that really launch off of anything that monitoring shows you. Of the 6 verticals, which are, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, cyber intrusion, currency manipulation, non-trade barriers, and subsidies to state-owned industries. The 2 keys are forced technology transfer and subsidies to state-owned industries. Until we get a monitoring, it's what David Goldman said. That their economic model is radically different. They look at themselves as the center of a manufacturing empire that One Belt, One Road consolidates on the Eurasian landmass through sub-Saharan Africa to the Caribbean and Latin America. Made in China 2025 leapfrogs us with AI, robotics, and artificial intelligence, and software and chip design. And then Huawei rolls out 5G, which takes quantum computing to the next level. That all has to be in here. Can it get done in the next couple of weeks? Absolutely not. But that's why this is an armistice. And you have someone like Bob Lighthizer, the partner of Skadden Arps, who's at the tip of the spear of this, and Peter Navarro. If their voices are heard and Lighthizer's allowed to get this deal, it's one of the reasons I believe that Prime Minister Abe is coming on a short trip and a turnaround this weekend in the White House. Not just with the Japanese deal. I think it's to raise the alarm about what a non-structural deal with China could hold.
Very briefly, I'm less worried about Chinese stealing our technology than American companies lining up to give it away to them, per Steve's point about the 5th column in the United States. I think we need radical export controls that prevent Boeing from selling satellites to China, as the Wall Street Journal reported earlier this week, that are used for surveillance, preventing Intel from creating a research center in China which advances Chinese skills and so forth. So I think putting our own house in order would be an urgent thing to do. In terms of large tariffs, we've got a simple problem. We don't produce this stuff anymore. Our biggest imports from China are smartphones, computers, tablets, and so forth. If we put on huge tariffs across the board, Americans will start paying a lot more for those products, and in that case, there might be a reaction. President Trump might not be reelected. So I agree with Steve. This is an armistice. We're not going to win everything in this round. We have to gauge profit and loss, benefit and cost, and move on to the strategically decisive things which are going to win the long war.
Let me take this gentleman right here, the bow tie. Stand by for a microphone. Identify yourself, please.
John French. Nobody has made any comments on the question of all the gold that China is squirreling away. What is your view if the Chinese at some point decide to back the yuan with gold and turn it into the reserve currency of the world, which would be very bad for us?
You can't turn your currency into a reserve currency. Would you put your checking account in RMB? I wouldn't. Everyone wants it in dollars, including the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are going to bribe our financial industry by giving them big franchises in China. UBS has already gotten a bank license. Allianz Insurance has already gotten an insurance license. JP Morgan will definitely be in there. All of the investment companies, BlackRock will be in there. And at that point, they hope over perhaps 10 years to develop a capital market sufficiently integrated with the West that would allow them to develop a reserve currency. So, we should be careful about what we wish for. There are some aspects of Chinese transparency which act as a bribe to our corporate sector and advance their own agenda in the long term.
I'd like to add something to that. When you look at the money supply in China, if you look at Chinese M2 at the end of last year I'm going to use dollars, hit $32 trillion on an economy of 12. Okay, they've printed more money than anyone ever has. Think about the U.S. debate is whether or not the Fed's balance sheet is incredibly too large at somewhere between 3 and 3.5 trillion. The Chinese have printed $32 trillion worth of their currency domestically, and they've held the price levels down on everything but real estate. And so, look, if they ever open their capital account, I don't know how many rich Chinese people that can't wait to buy more Chinese real estate and send their kids to school in China. But what's going to happen is the currency would immediately suffer a massive devaluation. So this idea of somehow finding first of all, the amount of gold ever mined in world history to date is about 7 trillion. And a lot of it's been used in industrial applications. Some of it's been used for dowry and jewelry. But they have $32 trillion worth of currency today, and they're growing at 3 or 4 trillion a year. There isn't enough gold in the world to index to some hard asset.
Good. Let's take this lady right here.
Thank you. My name is Loretta Hennessy. My question is, why are we not, and how can we, leverage the relationship with Japan to exert more pressure and to collaborate more clearly with them? They're our friends.
Well, I think it's a matter of an uncertain trumpet. The Japanese and the South Koreans are massive investors in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. Japan has more foreign assets than China does. And they certainly have the capacity to export technology. If we united with them, India and other countries, to create our own Belt and Road Initiative and pursue it seriously, I think we could chop up China's efforts in most of the world. We could do it much more effectively, particularly Southeast Asia, which is China's backyard and doesn't like doing business with the Chinese because they know them. So I think the answer is the Japanese have looked at us prevaricate, pivot to Asia, as Steve was saying, that's one Marine Brigade in Darwin, Australia, and wondering whether we're serious enough about it. They've got to live next to China, and if China's going to end up being the more powerful player because we failed, then they'll have to make an accommodation. If they're convinced that we're determined to win, I don't think we'll have a problem bringing them to our side.
Just a word about the Japanese. I've I've been going for over 40 years and have relationships there today. Do you know how many Chinese companies are in the Japanese stock exchange? I think the last count was 4, compared to our over 650. In part because that's the rigor of their disclosure requirements, the rigor of what it takes to get onto their market, versus the free lunch program that largely exists here, particularly in the OTC, the over-the-counter market. So this business about rigor and disclosure and transparency is essential. The Japanese fully appreciate the granularity of much of what I was talking about today. They're looking at troubled Chinese transactions around the world. Those Belt and Road Initiative projects that never came to fruition had safety problems, quality control, not just corruption and human rights and national security implications, but all manner of problems that have ensued. They are competing with a rigged system, but through exposing the Chinese for what they're really up to, which has been such a powerful theme this morning. So I think the Japanese are further ahead in terms of this kind of scrutiny and demand-oriented performance on the part of China than we are by a good bit. We have a lot to learn from them, but one thing for sure is they are at our side, particularly with Prime Minister Abe. I don't see any daylight between Japan and the United States today.
I think suffice it to say, they get that there's a present danger in the neighborhood. Yes, sir.
I'm David Braunschweig. I have one word and 2 questions. The one word that I haven't heard much today is Taiwan. The 2 questions are, what is the likelihood and the timing of China enacting its one country, 2 systems with China, meaning with Taiwan, meaning invading Taiwan? And the second question is, what would America do about it?
Those are absolutely critical questions because for us, Taiwan is in the center of our Western defense perimeter. We've drawn our Western defense perimeter not off of California or even Guam, but off the coast of Asia. Xi Jinping has been talking with increasing frequency about forceful measures to take Taiwan. And some people have said that he's even set a deadline of 2020, which I don't think that he's done. But nonetheless, as you see internal distress inside of China, the idea of taking over Taiwan by force if necessary becomes much more attractive to Xi Jinping, who is in a political position where he's put himself in a point where he's in jeopardy because he has deinstitutionalized the Communist Party, created a lot of enemies. And so misadventure abroad actually makes quite some sense for him politically. So I think that we've got to understand that we're facing a question not just 10 or 15 years down the road, but facing a question in the next couple years. As to the point of what the United States will do, that's always been very difficult for others to understand. Dean Acheson in 1950 put South Korea outside of the U.S. defense perimeter. And what did we do? We defended it, despite what he said. April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, told Saddam Hussein just 8 days before he invaded Kuwait that the United States wasn't going to be concerned about what she called intra-Arab disputes. What did we do? We defended Kuwait. I think that, unfortunately, we may have the same situation where we leave in the minds of the Chinese that we are not going to do anything, and that then, when something does occur, we are forced to respond. And that's the reason why the Committee on Present Danger is so important, is to marshal American will so that Xi Jinping never thinks that he can use force against any of his neighbors, including Taiwan.
Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and especially Taiwan are absolutely essential. The 2020 election season, before we even get to Iowa, we start with, I think, a more important election. That's Taiwan. And just this week, the mayor of, was it Kaohsiung Han, who has very close relationships with the CCP, dropped out, I think, yesterday for the KMT primary because Terry Guo of Foxconn, is now running. He got inspired by the goddess Mazu last week and said he's going to run for the KMT against either President Tsai or William Lei, one of the two candidates of the DPP. Or the DPP is all about independence, all about a relationship and partnership with the United States. And I think we have to ask the question, just like we have to ask Joe Biden and his family, what is your relationship with Chinese financial institutions? What is your relationship with senior members of the CCP? What were you doing in 2013 on Air Force Two with your son? At the same time, you were allowing, as Vice President of the United States, China to build these islands, these stationary aircraft carriers, because that's what they are in the South China Sea, and basically had the biggest give up of the West since Munich. We have to ask Terry Guo the exact same question, because they're not going to need to invade. They could do this through the ballot box, and they could do this through a massive influence operation that is going on in Taiwan right now. And Terry Guo of Foxconn, to me, has to answer the same questions. What is your relationship with the CCP? What financing have you gotten from the CCP? What do you have in mainland China? How does it operate with the CCP? And the people of Taiwan, I think, are owed those answers. And this campaign in 2020 for the presidency of Taiwan is going to be the kickoff to the presidential campaign of 2020 in the United States, because China, and the issue of China and the West, in particular the relationship of the United States and China, to me, is going to be the single most important topic that's discussed. Not wellness, not positivity, not mindfulness, not all these things that the Democrats are talking about today, but the hard reality of geopolitics.
Take a couple more. Yes, sir. Right here.
Thanks. Just to follow up, my name is Brian McCarthy. I'll follow up on a couple of the financial issues that have come up. I think Mr. Bannon called Wall Street the Investor Relations Department for China. As a big consumer of Wall Street research on China, it often struck me you'd get a research from 4 or 5 banks saying the exact same thing each morning. The chief China economist of all the big global banks is called into the PBOC once a quarter, and they are literally giving talking points. So investor relations is a nice way to put it. They're quite literally an extension of the Chinese propaganda effort. And my question would be on that one is, where's the SEC on this? Secondly, very refreshing to hear the commentary on the MSCI and Bloomberg Barclays bond index, which is even bigger, this index inclusion. This sounds like a bit of esoterica, but this is actually a really critical strategy for China to survive the next 3 or 4 years. China is desperate for dollars. As Mr. Bass has mentioned, the Chinese populace is just lined up to get money out of China. Every dollar that comes in, someone's ready to take it down and get it out. So, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars being forced into China, into markets that, because of the fact that Chinese people cannot get out, are by definition overvalued and at a disequilibrium. So where are the pension regulators and others who are supposed to be keeping an eye on the fiduciary responsibility that these index providers have to their clients and the ultimate beneficiaries?
Before Kyle jumps in, we're going to sign you up. This is why we formed the committee, to give people like you a platform to have this anguish you've had for the last number of years of what's going on here. Wall Street is the propaganda department of the CCP.
But your question is perfect. When you look at across the Wall Street banks and you look at the joint ventures that even the U.S. banks have with the Asian banks, the figureheads atop of those JVs are all members of the Chinese Communist Party. There should be some Reg FD disclosure out there, just like there is on analysts owning something. If you're going to read a piece of research, it should say, the vice chairman of the bank is a member of the CCP, and he actually edited this report, because it happens. And when we talk with chief economists about the very specific issues we talk about across Asia, I know some of them very well personally. They'll call me and they'll say, this is the real deficit, this is the augmented deficit. And I said, well, why don't you put that in your report? He says, well, they would never let that get printed in the report. And I said, but you are Bank XYZ here in the United States. He says, yeah, but our chairman in Asia is a CCP member, and it wouldn't make it through the edit. And it literally happens all the time. So I think Reg FD disclosures about Communist Party membership are absolutely necessary.
Last question. Yes, sir. Right over here.
Sorry, speaking of those banks, John Cheeseman, HSBC. I guess comment something that is also missing from the trade talks is on the human rights side in China, and probably something that the US should have a interest in. The second observation is how we invest as passive investors, through our 401k accounts. It does mean that right now money is just flowing exactly where these indices say, but it also means there's a great opportunity in this where people do have, it would be quite easy to have control over where your pension money does go. I did some work with an organization called Just Capital here in the US. Now, they rank US corporations by ethical standards, and there's a variety of them. And it's so far, it's actually pretty, unfortunately, it's pretty unsuccessful. People don't seem to care how ethical, where their money's going. And I was just wondering what organizations you feel are educating investors about the human rights atrocities that are happening across China, and how successful you think that will be.
Let me take a quick cut at that. It's one of the reasons, as Steve was just saying, that this new Committee on the Present Danger has been formed. We've focused here today, for obvious reasons, with this audience on the economic warfare piece of what the Chinese are doing. On the 2nd of May in Washington, we're going to have the second of our roundtable discussions there. In the last one of the featured presentations was from a Uyghur, talking about the concentration camps and what's happening to his people, but also making the broader point that there is a war on faith being mounted by the Chinese Communist Party. We will also be discussing a number of issues that we just didn't get to today, including what the Chinese are doing in space and the mortal threat that poses to us, both in terms of our economy and in terms of our national security. The military buildup, we haven't really touched on that at all today. Information warfare, we've gotten a little bit into that, but we'll do so much more on the 2nd. We've talked about the South China Sea, the issue of 5G. I had hoped we were going to spend some time talking to you about it, because this is an existential threat. Make no mistake about it, in the near term, if it turns out that it's a Chinese-owned and operated network, not one in which we are, in fact, in control of the system for everything from data management and Internet of Things to actually your personal safety. God help us if that's in the hands of the Chinese. So I think, unless anyone has anything else they wanted to add, we will wrap it with this further note. Please continue to consult presentdangerchina.org as a resource. We will try to keep you apprised of what we're doing. We're interested in the sorts of things that might help you make better decisions about what you're doing, specifically with respect to the case that's been made here, that we are enabling the present danger from China with our financial support and other investments and technology transfers, willing and unwilling. That must stop. And so must we. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to this great panel.